Now, Robert Luke was obviously, we have his pictures, a very, very handsome man. She married him and they moved to South Dakota. He had originally been a cattle buyer, the kind you read about and hear about in things like uh, Dodge City and Gunsmoke, but apparently they were real people. But after a crash sometime in the 20s, in that, he could no longer do that. He lost his job and ended up back in South Dakota, and where they lived was called Hard Luck Ranch. Apparently, grandmother actually despised living there because they were out in the middle of nowhere. And according to her, she had married this handsome man who lived this exciting life, going from place to place. And she ended up shortly thereafter out on this ranch in the middle of nowhere. She told me the story once of riding side saddle 20 miles, which I expect was greatly exaggerated, across country to see her sister-in-law. It might have been 5 or 6 or maybe even less, because grandmother had a tendency to rearrange her memories.
That sister-in-law would have been
That sister-in-law would have been one of Robert Luke's sisters.
like Aunt Maud or...
Could have been Aunt Maud. I don't know. She didn't tell me which one.
Okay.
Anyway, she had Leslie. And Leslie's pictures show that he was a very odd-looking child. I think he had some birth defect. Anyway, he died before he was 3 years old. And grandmother never seemed to quite get over that. After that, she had Grace, who was a beautiful, beautiful child, but apparently strong-willed and willful. Where she would have gotten that, we don't know. And then she had Bob. Somewhere along the line, grandmother got an infection in her inner ear. And apparently the pain was unbelievable. Having once had a terrible, terrible ear infection, I can attest to the pain. I was still working and having to take a half of a pain pill every hour just to go on. So apparently there was nothing back then for a mastoid infection, was what they called it. And finally the doctor said he could stop the pain, but he would have to do surgery. And what they did was they went behind one of her ears and made an incision and drilled into it. And when I looked at it as she was older, it looked like looking inside of a cornucopia. And the doctor apparently wasn't very skilled, and they didn't have the things back then they have now. And he nicked a nerve that caused one side of her face to collapse. And for weeks she sat in the dark in her room and cried and looked at herself in the mirror, because when she tried to eat, the food would dribble out of the corner of her mouth because she had no control over that side of her face. I believe that it made her go insane, because she gave the baby Bobby, who was 10 months old, and little Grace, who was about, not quite, or maybe a little over 3, she gave them to her husband's sister and just disappeared. Nobody knew for many years what had happened to her. Finally, years later, her daughter Grace met a woman whose name was Letha, and as they talked, it became clear that Letha was the child of Grover Saunders' wife. Not his child, but his stepchild. And so grandmother had lived off and on with Grover, and Letha took Aunt Grace to see her mother and Grover, and she gave Grace a suitcase, a leather suitcase that had been left in that garage for over 20 years. And it belonged to Grace's mother, my grandmother, Liona. Grace did not open it for years because she wanted to be sure that her brother Bob was with her. When they opened it, they discovered that those 10 years that nobody knew where Liona was had been occupied with her probably in Kansas City, where she had met and married a man whose last name was Tracey. And she had given birth to 2 more children, Jack and
Bill.
Bill.
William.
His name was William. And we didn't know it, and for years I tried to find them. Finally, through Ancestry.com, Sue found them. And
With the DNA.
through the DNA, she found them, and she discovered that I have a first cousin, well, a half cousin, somewhere out west. But this cousin, whose name is Vivian Carbonneau, I believe is the way
Yes.
to say it, does not want anything to do with our family because she feels that our grandmother, Liona, had hurt her father, who would be, grandmother would be her grandmother too, so badly that it would be disloyal to her father to have anything to do with the rest of Liona's descendants. And that made me sad, but there's nothing I can do about it. But we don't know much about Tracey. We have seen pictures of her boys, and they're obviously connected to our family.
Oh, Vivian did communicate with me, and she sent pictures of the man that Liona married and the two boys. But she just didn't want to continue doing more because of her father's memory.
Okay. Anyway, both of the boys have passed away. All of Liona's children are now gone. There was Bernie, who was the oldest, Burnham. There was Leslie, who died. Then there was Grace. Her name was Grace Louise. And then there was Robert Grover. And then there was this William and Jack. So she had a lot of children, but they're all gone. Anyway, we know very little about the Tracey family, but we do know that they were divorced legally, we're glad, and ultimately she met and married George Saunders. George Allenbach. And she and he lived in Pueblo, Colorado for a long time. He was originally a builder and built grocery stores throughout that area for a company called Safeway. We know that he died in 1948, and grandmother went back to being a professional cook. Now, I never knew the full story of her being a professional cook. I do have one treasure from my grandmother. I have these huge clean-cut scissors that she bought secondhand during World War II when she worked in a parachute factory. I do know that after George died, he left her only $800 in 1948. The home they had lived in and everything else he had deeded to his children by a previous marriage. So she was very close to destitute because she hadn't worked in several years. She went to work as this cook, and she slept in a cot in a basement that was very damp, and she got pneumonia. And while she was sick, she found an ad to go to school to be an LPN, a licensed practical nurse. The only catch was it said you had to be under 50. Well, grandmother was 59, but she had beautiful skin, they say, and she looked good for her years. So she applied for this schooling, and she was accepted because she lied and told them she was 49 instead of 59. In those days, you didn't seem to have very much of anything. All you had to do was say who you were. So she moved to Evanston, Illinois, went to school, got a job in a nursing home as an LPN, where she worked apparently most of the time the midnight shift. She was furnished room and board, and so her salary, which I don't know how much it was, but apparently it was adequate since she didn't have to buy much of anything. She worked there until she was actually 72, but she told them she was 62, so she decided she would retire and draw her Social Security, Medicare, whatever they had. She moved back to La Center and rented a house out on a highway. She had no car and no driver's license anymore. And she said it was the most boring, damned place she ever stayed in her life. And she had sent for her brother Grover, who had lived in Kansas City at the time. He came and lived with her, but they never got along. And he would spend most of his time out in the shed, smoking and I think drinking because he was an alcoholic. Finally, grandmother decided she couldn't stand it anymore. So she had a sale and she sold everything that was in this little rental house. She bought Grover a ticket and sent him back to the Little Sisters of the Poor in Kansas City. She bought herself either a plane or a train ticket and she went to Arizona because she said that damn Kentucky weather was killing her arthritis. And so we saw very little of her during those years. But ultimately, she went to work for a family called Steen. I never could remember the old man and old woman's name. They were younger than she was, but since she was so good at lying about her age, she told them she was 10 years younger than she was, and they hired her to take care of the both of them. She cooked for them, she saw that they had their medications, and she did very light housekeeping. And she lived there until the old lady died. Now, for a woman who'd been married at least 4 times, we don't know if there were any others, she had a rather proper idea, and it just wasn't right for her to live with this man by himself without marrying him with his wife dead. So she packed up her suitcases and flew back to Kentucky. On the way, she went and stayed in Evanston for several weeks, where we learned later that she had had a facelift. And when she got off the plane in Paducah, she had on slacks, which Daddy had never seen her wear before. And she had on this houndstooth check suit with a cape and half of it thrown back and a little pillbox hat. This was in the 60s, and she was very stylish looking. And Daddy walked up to her when she got off the plane and he said, "Mother, is that you?" And she said, "Why, yes, Burnham. Do you think I look different?" He said, "Well, I don't know what it is, but you sure as hell do." And so she stayed with us for a while, where she drove my dear poor mother half crazy. But ultimately, the daughter of the man named Steen kept calling and calling and calling and begging her to come back, because she kept hiring people to take care of the old man, and he would run them off because they weren't Lee, which was what he called grandmother. So grandmother finally made a deal with her. She said she would come back if the woman would add a bathroom to the house that she could use for her sole use, and an exit where she could go in and out at will without having to go through the rest of the house. Apparently, Mr. Steen had acquired quite a bit of money from stocks. The story goes, and remember, this is grandmother's story, that he worked as a truck driver, driving delivery trucks for Sears for many years, but he bought Sears and Roebuck stock as it grew over the years and had become a millionaire from it. And so he had this gorgeous house in Phoenix, complete with a walled garden and a pool. And she wanted to be able to go in and out at will. And the woman built all of that and sent her a ticket to fly home because she was so desperate for someone to take care of the father. And grandmother and the man lived there for several more years. But ultimately, according to grandmother, the area went down and people were always throwing things over the wall and throwing things in the pool, and they became afraid to live there. So the old man put the house on the market and bought them a place, and I think it was a double or triple wide trailer in a place called Sun City, 40 miles out of Phoenix proper. Now, when grandmother was 86 or 87, the old man was 85. He died, and she was extremely upset. And she, of course, called my dad, and Dad said, "Somebody has got to go get her." And he made a deal with me that I would go and get her, and that he would pay for my ticket out there and back. And for my trouble, he bought me this beautiful Anya red leather coat, a matching pair of boots, and a matching purse. I went after grandmother, and she was hysterical by the time I got there, because she had wanted me to take a taxi for 40 miles from the airport, which I refused to do because I knew how to get around. And so I had rented a little car and gotten a map and drove to her front door. She was in the process of calling the police to look for me, thinking that I had been kidnapped or was dead or something. And I told her, I said, "Grandmother, I just knew that we couldn't do a taxi here. We're going to be here for over a week, and we have got to get all of your business." She said, "You can read a map?" I said, "Grandmother, I can read a map. This is 1976. I have a master's degree. I'm a school teacher. I've been all over the country. Jim and I go places, and he drives and pulls the trailer, and I navigate. I don't know how you do it. I can't read a map at all." And it occurred to me that the only place she'd ever driven was in Pueblo, Colorado. And every other place she'd ever been, she'd either flown or taken a train. But unfortunately, my parents both died in 1979. Well, before they passed away, Grandmother had gotten up one night to use the bathroom, but she didn't turn on the light, and when she started to sit down, she missed the commode, and in that she fell and broke her hip, and she lay on that floor the rest of the night trying to get someone's attention, but she had closed the door tightly because she wanted her privacy. And when Mother and Daddy found her the next morning, they had to call an ambulance and take her to the hospital. Well, in those days, the late 70s, no one knew how to replace hips for someone her age, and so it became quite clear that she was never going to walk again. But Grandmother, being who she was in a rage because they put the side up on her bed, and somehow during the night, Grandmother managed to pull herself and crawl over the foot of the bed and fall off where she broke the other hip. She ended up in a nursing home in Paducah, and since I taught at Paducah Tillman, I was assigned as her guardian, and I took care of her money and her business and everything for the rest of her life, and she lived 10 years in a nursing home. I had her in different nursing homes, 2 or 3 different ones in Paducah, 2 different ones in Benton. The first one was excellent, the second was horrible, and it cost more than the first. And then ultimately I was able to get her into the nursing home in Calvert City, Kentucky, which was excellent, and is where she finished up her life, and she died in December 1987 at the age of 97 and a half years old.